Hello, this is an introduction to the horror genre. It's been created using Office Mix, and so you'll find along the way some quizzes in there just to see that you're paying attention. That's if you're viewing this through the Office Mix viewer. Otherwise, it'll just be a plain old video. Well, welcome aboard, and let's get started. By beginning with the aims of what we're trying to achieve here, we'll be able to get a sense of where we're going. And so we want to be able to describe the main features of the horror genre and to be able to identify some of the developments of the genre over time. But also we really want to be able to understand how changing contexts influence the development of the horror genre. To begin with, the defining feature of horror is its effect. The aim is to provoke an emotional, psychological, or physical response in the reader, and perhaps the best way to look at this is through a quote here from H.P. Lovecraft, one of the great horror writers of the early 20th century. He says that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. This might seem a bit of a truism, but when we think about those horror stories that we've read, it's not simply the fear of the monster or the vampire. It's usually the sense of suspense that we have of something unknown and mysterious to us. Another way of thinking about the genre is to think about its sociological impact or even psychological impact. This is a long quote, but I think it's really useful. It's from Elizabeth Barrett, from her book Elements of Aversion. And she's looking at horror as something that emerges long after the Middle Ages, when the world has really become a lot safer, that there's not the imminence of death that there might have been in earlier centuries. And she says that, so we told each other stories through the long, dark nights, when the fires burned low. We did our best to scare the daylights out of each other. The rush of adrenaline feels good. Our hearts pound, our breath quickens, and we can imagine ourselves on the edge. Yet we also appreciate the insightful aspects of horror. Sometimes the story intends to shock and disgust. But the best horror intends to rattle our cages and shake us out of our complacency. It makes us think, forces us to confront ideas we might rather ignore, and challenges preconceptions of all kinds. Horror reminds us that the world is not always as safe as it seems, which exercises our mental muscles and reminds us to keep a little healthy caution close at hand. I like this quote because of what it says about reminding us that the world is not always safe and shaking us out of our complacency. But it's the idea here that horror forces us to confront uncomfortable ideas, and oftentimes when we get into the contextual discussion later, you'll be able to see how the horror genre evolves as part of these social conversations about important social issues or even psychological and moral issues. A much simpler way to understand the genre is to think of horror as having a monster who represents a physical, psychological, moral, or social menace. The second point I make here is a bit of an adaptation from a film critic called Robin Wood. And the idea here is that the monster will disrupt the normal state of the world. And once it's destroyed, normality is re-established and sometimes changed. And notice here that the word monster here has quotes around it, scare quotes around it, and that's because the monster doesn't necessarily have to be a literal werewolf. The monster could be more psychological. In fact, the monster in some horror could even be within ourselves. Settings are critical in the horror genre. And they might include those that are ominous and foreboding. It could be the eerie haunted house, or it could be some kind of a dungeon or a castle. Even in more recent times, you find settings for horror stories being hospitals or psychiatric wards. Basically any kind of setting that often feels enclosed or where you can't escape. Let's now have a look at some of the developments in genre. Gothic horror stories emerged from folklore, but in the 18th century novels began to incorporate the supernatural. So there's folklore. We know our Brothers Grimm stories and our fairy tales. Well, horror emerges straight out of those. It emerges really straight out of Little Red Riding Hood, even. Interestingly, if we take that story of Little Red Riding Hood, it would later be adapted by Angela Carter into a short story called The Company of Wolves in a really interesting way. In the 19th century, horror would really start to mature. The Gothic tradition blossomed into what we now call horror, with the icons of modern horror emerging. We have the Dracula character, we have Frankenstein, and we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These are some key stories. These characters become archetypes in the horror genre that would later be adapted and melded into new kinds in the 20th century. In the 20th century, cinema propels the genre, but literary works continued to develop. We have Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House, perhaps the archetypal haunted house novel, and Stephen King is arguably the greatest name in the horror genre. We have Christine here about a haunted, a possessed car, but then we have The Shining, we have Salem's Lot, and we have Carrie. The list is endless. I Am Legend is arguably it's one of the great vampire novels, and it's an important one in the 20th century because it takes that Dracula story and melds it into this apocalyptic story that would then 50 years later become or mature into something like World War Z, which is written by Max Brooks as an oral history of the zombie apocalypse. And Dean Koontz, who I've got to admit I haven't read much of, but he's another one of those key figures in 20th century horror fiction. So while cinema would have a lot of influence over the kinds of horror that would be created in the 20th century, we've seen stuff happening in the early 21st century and at the end of the 20th century where we've seen the horror genre being manipulated through genre mashups, teen fiction, and the graphic novel. We have Pride and Prejudice and zombies, so taking the classic Jane Austen and mashing it up with the zombie fiction genre. And we have Twilight, which isn't the first, but it's a really significant series that brings the horror genre into this teen romance genre in a really interesting way. Walking Dead, you may know from the TV series, but it began life as a graphic novel series about this zombie apocalypse. And we have here the Van Helsing graphic novel series. And the character of Van Helsing comes out of Bram Stoker's Dracula and brings it into this more modern world. Context is a tricky term that you might have already encountered, and there's a couple of ways of looking at it. This first definition, that context is the social and historical surroundings of when a text is made. So that means that when we write about context, we write about what was going on in the world of the text and its author might have influenced what's inside it, the content, the structure, even the language of the text. This second definition shifts the focus from the text to the reader and is suggesting that context is the social and historical surroundings of when a text is read. And so when we write about readers' contexts, we write about how the reader's own values and attitudes and those that prevail in the world of the reader affect the meanings made. This becomes really important when we look at how meanings shift and how we look at how a text written in the middle of the 1800s can have its meaning shift over the ensuing century because of those changing values and attitudes. I really want to focus on the first definition of context that I gave you, the one about the social and historical conditions and the ideas surrounding when a text was made. And so in this example here, we see Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and the explosion in scientific advances in the early 1800s inspired the idea in this novel of a scientist using electricity to breathe life into a corpse. This is a novel that echoes all the social and historical events and moments that were happening when it was made. Dracula comes about 80 years after Frankenstein, but it also reflects the predominant values and attitudes of the time in which it was created. It reflects the strict social rules of the Victorian period and the rising anger against the upper classes and how these informed the way vampires were depicted in Stoker's novel. The character of Lucy in the novel is somewhat promiscuous and flirtatious, and she becomes a vampire and is then destroyed. This reflects the fear of female sexuality that predominated the Victorian period. But also the character of Dracula himself is this old world aristocrat. He's European and he's incredibly wealthy and he's decadent. And so this novel here also reflects that growing antipathy towards this old world aristocracy as this decaying, irrelevant force that still is visible in the Victorian world. And so the point here is that context isn't just a history lesson. Context directly impacts on the kinds of stories that get told at different times. And not just the kinds of stories that get told, but how they are told. And so we can't divorce our reading of text. We can't divorce the meaning of what's happening in the text from the kinds of social forces that went into creating it. I'm going to preface this slide by saying that this is incredibly simplistic, but hopefully it'll help you understand this concept of context. And so I'm going to take this idea that new context can create new fears. In the Romantic period, that fear was around science, all kinds of new things happening, new possibilities at the time, but from that emerges fear of science, a fear of this unknown surrounding science, and we see that certainly in Frankenstein. We also see in the Victorian period a fear of female sexuality. Definitely see that in Dracula, and we see throughout Victorian literature the need to suppress and control female sexuality. In the 1940s, we see this fear of Nazis and totalitarianism, and that would influence how texts were created at the time. You definitely see this in the comic book genre with Captain America emerging and what's happening with the Superman character. And so we have things happening in the 1940s that directly impact on what happens inside texts. And in the 1950s, the fear was Russia. It's the beginning of the Cold War. And we see the emergence of these apocalyptic kind of texts emerging. We have I Am Legend coming about, and the emergence of the zombie genre in the 1960s. And we see this in cinema in particular. The fear of Russian invasion would create texts that were about invasions of different kinds. One of the great sci-fi horror films, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, is regarded as a comment on this fear of Russian invasion in the Cold War. And so now to recap everything you've learned. Horror is all about fear and dread, fear of the unknown, dread of imminent violence. Horror continues to evolve in response to changing context and will continue to evolve because our context keeps changing, the world keeps changing. The current fear of terrorism is no doubt influencing the kinds of texts that will be emerging over the coming years. And the ways horror stories are created continue to change. And we're talking about new developments in technology, particularly in cinema, but that it will influence the way literature is written. And it changes the kinds of stories and the way stories are told, such as Max Brooks's World War Z, written as an oral history. It's a new way of writing narratives. Horror stories can reveal underlying social fears and anxieties. And to really get your head around this, I urge you to read and view different kinds of horror texts, going back as far as you can, and looking at the kinds of things that were important in those periods. So these are the key ideas here, and throughout this unit we'll be touching on all of these. And these concepts, even though we're talking about the horror genre, apply to all different genres. And so these ideas about the intent of the genre and the influence of context are really important, and I hope this has helped you understand those. Well, that brings us to the end, and I hope that's been helpful for you. I hope you've been able to use this using the Office Mix site, and I can see some of the feedback from the quiz entries that you do. Good luck.